We spent many months and made dozens of batches in the pursuit of trying to find a recipe and some foolproof techniques to help you do it right the first time.
Let's be honest, chocolate chip cookies are always good, but when you have a really, really good one, it's life-changing. We pretty much bought all the chocolate chips in New York City. We baked, we tested, we ate, and now we have the ultimate chocolate chip recipe for you. We're gonna ball out with a few extra flavors, but really all you need for cookies are sugar, flour, fat, eggs, and chocolate. And on our quest to find the best, we had to test out what all of these ingredients do to a cookie and how we can use their best properties to come up with the ultimate recipe. Let's talk sugar. So we've got white sugar, light brown sugar, and dark brown sugar. Really the only difference is the addition of molasses. Light brown sugar has a bit of molasses and dark brown has a bit more molasses in it. For this test, we wanted to see what just using one sugar in each dough would do to a cookie. With all white sugar, spread the most, didn't have a ton of flavor. Light brown sugar was a little bit chewier, spread a little bit less, and the dark brown sugar was really overpowering in its flavor and spread the least. And visually, you can see a big difference too. And what we found was you really can't get that classic flavor just using one. Next thing we had to tackle is flour. So we've got all-purpose, bread flour, and cake flour. Really the only difference here is the amount of protein and therefore gluten in these flours. Just think about it like this. Bread's like really nice and chewy, has a great texture, great structure, having that gluten and protein. Whereas cake, you think of it as tender, it's light, it's airy, it's gonna have less of those things. What it really comes down to is taste and texture. All-purpose gave you, standard cookie. The bread flour led to a significantly chewier cookie. The cake flour was the one that really spread the most. It was pretty delicate. And then similar to sugar, we decided that in order to get the best result, you gotta use a combination of two. So on to fat. We wanted to see the difference between softened butter and melted butter. And then we wanted to see what would happen if we switched it out completely and used coconut oil. Between softened butter and melted butter, visually they look pretty similar. The melted butter spread a little bit more. And then taste, we didn't notice a huge difference either. Tested with coconut oil and it worked. It was a cookie, but it lost like that great oomph, that butter brings to all baked goods. And so in the end, we definitely prefer using butter. Eggs, we went pretty simple with this one. Just an egg and an egg yolk contributes to more of like a fudgier, richer cookie. Obviously, we're making chocolate chip cookies. We have to have chocolate chips, but we're also gonna add a little bit something extra with some chunks of dark chocolate. Cut it with a serrated knife into little chunks and add that to your dough. It's really nice because you have like a variance of flavors and textures throughout. It's really just a few fundamental ingredients and learning how to master their properties in order to get the best result that you're after. And finally, after all that testing, we came up with our ultimate recipe. Here we go. So we're gonna start by sifting out the flour. We're gonna do all-purpose and bread flour, salt and baking soda as well. We really liked the chew factor of the bread flour with a combination of all-purpose to kind of give us best of both worlds. And then we're gonna move on to the butter. So we're gonna do melted butter, but we're gonna take it one step further and brown it. All you need to do to make brown butter is throw it all in the saucepan and get it to a boil. After a few minutes of boiling, the milk solids in the butter are gonna start to toast and turn a really gorgeous brown, nutty color. Keep stirring it to make sure that the butter is browning evenly. And once you can see the really dark brown bits on the bottom, you're gonna pour it off, ideally into a liquid measuring cup. This is gonna do two things. One, it's going to quickly cool down the butter so it stops the cooking. You don't wanna burn it. And then also we wanna make sure that we have a cup of liquid when it's all said and done. So while making the brown butter, you do end up boiling off a good amount of liquid. So we're just gonna top it up with a bit of water until we reach 1 cup. So just let it chill out for a bit, come to room temperature before you proceed. So we found that we really need a combination of white and dark brown sugar to get that really great flavor that we were after. So add the vanilla at this point and the espresso powder. The espresso powder is one of those little flavor boosters. Again, all about those contrasting notes that really work well with anything really sweet. And then you're gonna add in that liquid gold. Oh my gosh, so nice. And cream those together. This is another reason why we want the butter to be a little bit on the cooler side and incorporates really, really nicely with the sugar. When we were testing, if you add the brown butter when it's too hot, it can make the dough a little bit greasy. Then in go the egg and the egg yolk. Ugh, and the smell that comes off this thing, oh my God. It's pretty much like the best smell you can get from cooking. And then go the flour. We like to do it in about thirds or so, just so they don't have flour going all over your kitchen. And just beat it until you don't see a ton of extra flour. It doesn't need to be totally incorporated. A little bit of flour that's not incorporated is actually good. You'll finish incorporating the rest of the flour when you fold in the chocolate. The nice thing about using these chunks is that you get some small shards of chocolate that kind of get everywhere, mixed with the chopped up chocolate chunks, and it's just kind of like, ugh, so good. And that's it. That's your dough. Try not to eat it all when it's raw. All right, so if you're an A+ student, you can go ahead and put these in the fridge to chill overnight. You'll get the best flavor that way, but if you have no self-restraint like me, you can bake them off right now. The nice thing about this dough is it has so much flavor that we've built into it that they're still gonna be really, really good if you bake them right away. If you are gonna be amazing and put them in the fridge overnight, we do recommend scooping them first and putting them on a baking sheet, then putting them in the fridge. It's just so much easier than trying to scoop a really hard dough from the fridge. Cookies are kind of the equalizer of all baked goods. You know, there's so much fancy stuff out there, but honestly, is there anything better than a perfect chocolate chip cookie? Just look at that. You've got these pockets of chocolate from using those big chocolate chunks. It's got all the cracks and crinkles that you want in a chocolate chip cookie. The center's ooey gooey. The outside is crunchy. It's just got kind of like all the flavor and texture that you could possibly pack into one little cookie. And you'll never go back to another recipe again. There's a list of like top 5 smells in the culinary world, and I'm pretty sure butter comes up number 1 all the time. Eggs are quick, cheap, and easy, and if you don't have them in your fridge already, you probably should. Here are 5 easy ways to cook eggs perfectly every time. You don't need much for these first 2 preparations. All you need is a good non-stick skillet that doesn't have any scratches on it, a rubber spatula, some salt and pepper, and a good amount of butter. You want to use a non-stick skillet. Eggs are notoriously sticky because of all the protein and a lot of other stuff in there. And you also want to make sure that you're not using any metal utensils on the pan itself. First up, scrambled eggs, one of my personal faves. Scrambled eggs, there's a lot of different ways to cook them. This is the way that we prefer at the Tasty Kitchen. It's a great idea to crack them into a separate bowl first. One, in case you have any big chunks of eggshell in there. If any shell does get into the bowl itself, totally fine. Take an eggshell that you just cracked and use that to go in and get the shell out. While it might seem easier to crack them into the pan and scramble them in there, it's not really a good even way to do it. You'll have some big chunks of egg white, some big chunks of egg yolk. Just trust me, it's an easy bowl to clean. Just throw them in a bowl first and scramble them in there. So instead of adding milk or cream, we just use a lot of butter. You start with about 2 tablespoons of butter, get it nice and foamy in the pan, and when it's pretty much all the way melted, we're gonna season our eggs with a bit of salt and pepper and any other seasonings you want, and then into the pan. We want to keep our heat pretty low here, and we're actually not going to move the eggs at all until we kind of see a little bit of the egg setting on the sides of the pan. When you start to see a little bit of the eggs set, that's when you want to take a rubber spatula and from the outside in, push the eggs towards the center and kind of all around the pan so that all the eggs are cooking pretty evenly. When they're about 3/4 of the way cooked, we're going to do a real sneaky trick here and add a few cubes of butter. That's another tablespoon cut into 4s or so. We're gonna melt those cubes of butter into the eggs themselves, and they're gonna kind of emulsify sort of this like creamy, nice meltiness into the scrambled eggs, and they add this like really beautiful creamy texture at the end. So we recommend taking them off a little bit before you think. The residual heat within the eggs will continue to cook them until they're the perfect doneness. I mean, it definitely takes an art and takes a little bit of time to get the scrambled egg right, but there's just something so good about it. It just kind of like hits all those salty, creamy, fatty notes for me, and I just really, really love having scrambled eggs. The fried egg. I think people are afraid of fried eggs. I don't know, there's like so many different ways to do it. It's like, should the pan be high heat? Should it be low? How do you get that perfect color? We're gonna do ours on a medium heat for the fried egg. So add butter to the pan, add your egg into the butter. So you want it to be hot enough that the egg white is kind of setting when it goes in. Let it start cooking, and you wanna make sure that it's not so hot that the egg white itself is like going all over and boiling like crazy. Add just a few drops of water at this point and immediately cover with a lid. And that's gonna create a good amount of steam in the pan. So it's gonna help cook the egg white without being on such a high heat that the egg yolk will cook through as well. At that point, once it's cooked for a few minutes, you have the world's most picture-perfect egg. Really yellow, vibrant yolk. The white is cooked through. There's none of that weird, like, snotty bit that no one likes, like undercooked egg white. It just takes maybe a minute or 2 with that steam on top, and then you have a picture-perfect egg. I mean, you could Instagram that. There's a million things on the internet of like how to get the perfectly hard-boiled egg. We've tested a whole bunch, and this is our tried and true method to get your perfect boiled egg every time. You want to put them over medium-high heat because you want to bring them to a boil, but you want it to kind of happen slowly. So similar to potatoes, we're doing this because we want them to cook really evenly. We don't want the outside to cook before the inside can. Once it's at a rolling boil, you want to take it off the heat, cover, and set your timer. between 4 and 16 minutes, depending on how you like your yolks cooked. And then once they're cooked to your liking, you want to immediately take the eggs out and put them into an ice bath. That's going to stop the cooking right away to make sure that your yolk is going to be cooked to your preference. If you leave them in the hot water or just like take them out of the hot water and don't cool them down, then you'll get that like really weird, chalky, like grayish green yolk, which we don't want. And just as a visual, here are eggs cooked at all of these different times. You can see how much softer the yolk is at 4 minutes, whereas 16 it's completely cooked through. You can just cut them in halves or quarters, throw them right on top of the salad. They add like a nice amount of color and freshness, I think. They're also a really good snack as well, but there's a million different recipes you can use for hard-boiled eggs. Poached. All right, so for poaching eggs, which I honestly don't think is too scary, you want to use a big pot of water. There's just like more room for the egg to kind of move around, and you want to make sure that your pot of water is, I know this sounds crazy, but like at a hard simmer. Like you don't want it so boiling that the water is really disruptive and it's gonna shake the egg a ton, but if it's not moving at all, then the egg will just completely sink to the bottom and there won't be any movement rolling that egg white over the egg yolk. Similar to scrambled eggs, you're always going to want to make sure that you're cracking your eggs into a bowl first. And then we're going to do a whirlpool trick. So you're going to stick your spoon in, swirl the water, and then that center whirlpool is where we're going to drop our egg into. As it's slowing down is when you want to add your egg. If it's still going too heavy, if the whirlpool's too fast, then the egg's just going to be like, whoa. You want to let the egg go and do its thing in there until you kind of can't see any of that translucent egg white anymore. With a poached egg, you want the egg yolk to still be quite runny, but again, no one wants like a runny egg white. And that is a poached egg. So we're gonna blot it, get all the extra water off there, and then you're ready to eat. So that's the traditional method, but if you were doing a whole bunch, we've got a trick for you. So instead of a big deep pot, we're just gonna use like a saute pan that has flat sides, like 3 or 4 inches deep, that you can put some of these heat-safe glass bowls and have them completely covered in water. And for this one, I can do like 3, maybe even 4 at a time, depending on how big your bowls are and how big your pot is. And then same deal, you want to crack your eggs into a separate dish. But what I'm going to do is actually go from one dish to another. And what that bowl is going to do is it's going to keep the egg contained in that space. This is cool because you can get a nice rounded shape every time, but it's gonna look a little bit different than your classic poached egg. If you're just doing this for your friends and family at home, I don't think anyone will mind. It'll still taste the same. It's easier for you to do a whole bunch of them. And then it's a little less intimidating way to approach poached eggs. Really good, nice, soft, delicate way to have an egg. And it's also kind of an impressive way to serve something that's pretty cheap. I love poached eggs.
Yeah. Are poached your favorite? Wait. We know
I think my problem is I don't have a favorite. I like them all. If I had children, they'd be eggs. Can't really choose one, right? Depends on the day. Every city in the country, every city in the world probably, has a pizza place. It's usually pretty good, it's usually pretty cheap, but there's something about making your own at home that just really drives the point home. Do you know anyone that doesn't like pizza? I don't want to know that person. Honestly, making pizza only takes a few simple ingredients. What you're gonna need is a little bit of warm water. It's gonna activate a good amount of dried yeast, a bit of sugar that's gonna act as food for the yeast, salt for flavor, flour for the base of the dough. Extra virgin olive oil that's gonna, 1, make your dough a little bit easier to work with, and it's also gonna add just a little hint of flavor. All right, so first things first, we have to bloom our yeast. So in warm water, and by warm I just mean like when you put your finger in, it shouldn't feel like anything. It's not cold or hot. So you're gonna give it a stir, make sure everything's well hydrated, and then you're gonna see that your yeast is gonna start to produce a little bit of bubbles, and it just means that it's kind of alive. If you don't see any change, that means that your yeast might be a little on the old side. Throw that out and start again with some fresh yeast. We're gonna add salt to the flour and not to the yeast water mixture. Salt will slow down the production of yeast, so we wanna make sure that we're adding that later on once the yeast is already activated. We're gonna add extra virgin olive oil. Again, it's gonna add a little bit of flavor. We're gonna throw in the water and sugar mixture. It's easiest in a bowl because it won't like make a huge mess while you bring the dough together. What we're trying to do is just hydrate as much of the flour as we can. Once we're happy that we're not gonna have like water or flour all over the place, we can toss it onto our board and start kneading it. So kneading is one of those things that like people tend to not do enough. Set a timer and do it for 10 minutes. You wanna be able to look at it and it's like so pokey and smooth and fun. And what you're trying to do is just roll the dough on top of itself and then push forward. You're not trying to tear the dough. You're really just trying to like rotate and make sure that you're getting like all parts of the dough incorporated. At the end of it, we want like a really nice, pretty top. You'll know when you're done kneading the dough when you press the dough and it springs back right away. So now what we want to do is get like the really gorgeous top part of the dough. You can just pull the sides of the dough from the outside in so that it makes a nice ball on the other side. Once you turn it over, push your pinkies in and kind of rotate the dough and do like a really beautiful round ball. All right, cool, so ready to rise. And we're gonna go into a big bowl, put a little bit of oil in there so that the dough doesn't stick. And then you're gonna cover the dough itself in oil as well. This is gonna rise significantly and we don't want to stick to the cling film. So I like to cover with cling so that it's much easier to get off. Like I've done a lot of doughs where you cover with a towel and then it gets stuck to the towel, so I prefer cling. So you can let this rise for an hour if you don't have a ton of time. Even better would be to let this rise overnight. So the one on the left is one that's been risen for 24 hours and the one on the right has been rising for an hour. It's still gonna be a great flavor, it's still gonna be a great texture. So the longer you let this process go, just like the more flavor and the more complexity is gonna be in your dough. And what we're gonna do now is just bring this dough back to life. So a lot of work has happened with all this yeast and it's been a little bit uneven in the way that it's grown. And that's just like a totally normal process. So we're gonna turn it out and we're gonna knead it again for another minute or two. Nothing different about this process. Again, we're just evening out the bubbles that are inside the dough. We're gonna do that shaping thing again. So use your pinkies, if you will, to kind of push to make it into a cute ball. And if you're using store-bought pizza dough, you want to do this as well. So knead it for a minute or two and leave it out at room temperature while you're doing all of your other pizza prep. And then we're going to cut it. So as you can see, now that we've cut into this, you can look at that cool I just love that. It's so cool. Okay, sorry. Back to what we're talking about. So you can see like just how much gluten development, just how much fermentation and growth and all the yeastiness, sciencey stuff is going on, how alive our dough is. Like that's an awesome process to see. So this is a huge amount of dough. It should make about 4 good-sized pizzas. You can give one to each person at your party, each person in your family. You can shape them, you can freeze half of them or freeze 3 of them so you have some for later. It's really up to you. Add a little bit more flour, cover it with a towel and let it rise for 1 more hour. One thing that you want to recreate from a pizzeria in your own home kitchen is getting your oven as hot as it possibly can. One thing that's going to help that is having something in the oven already preheating that's going to give you really good bottom heat. So you could do a baking sheet turned upside down. You could do a cast iron, which is really great at holding heat. And then third option, if you are going to be making like a lot of bread or pizzas at home, is to get a pizza stone. And that really holds a lot of heat as well. And it's like a nice open surface. So let's talk sauce. There's a lot of different options out there and people never really know which ones to get. So there's puree, and that's gonna be like the finest of all of the tomatoes. Then there's gonna be crushed. That might have a little bit of chunk left in it. Diced is gonna be diced. So it's just cut up already, it's in its sauce, it's in its water. And then there's whole tomatoes. And so those are the most intact, and those are the ones that I recommend. You can crush them with your hands, or as we're gonna do here, we're just gonna use an immersion blender. Little safety PSA, if you have any leftover sauce, do not store it in the tin can, store it in a separate container and make sure to throw the can away. Now let's talk cheese. The thing about pre-shredded cheese is it has some product on it that prevents it from clumping in the bag. It just kind of doesn't allow things to melt as easily. If you shred the cheese yourself, it's gonna be much softer. It's gonna be a better flavor in the end. So if you have the option, we do recommend that you shred the cheese yourself. One thing about using fresh mozzarella is that you can leave the chunks as big as you want. So if you're super cheesy, you can have huge chunks on your pizza. So now that our dough is rested, it's ready to be shaped. There's a lot of different ways that you can get your dough out to a good shape. What I like to do is kind of do like a finger poke, if you will, all over the dough. One, because it's so fun, but also if you can see these kind of bubbles that are developing, I'm allowing those to stay in the dough, and then those are gonna help give you those awesome pizza bubbles. You can stretch the dough with your hands, just kind of being really careful. You can use your fingers and kind of spread it, if you will, do a combo of things. I used to work at a pizza place and the guy would actually put the dough on the side of the table and kind of stretch it that way, and he would let gravity work its magic and kind of let the dough stretch out itself. It was kind of fun. I thought it was a cool technique. He was able to do it much quicker and smoother than I'm able to do. And then the classic way that everyone wants to know how to learn is the tossing of the dough technique. So you kind of want to create a spinning motion with your knuckles as you're throwing it in the air. So on your knuckles, rotate and toss, catch. So now it's time to assemble our pizza. So we're gonna use a turned over baking sheet. So this is gonna act as our peel. And a peel is that cool plank that they have at a pizzeria that helps get the pizzas in and out of the oven. And we're gonna use a little bit of semolina. If you don't have that, you can use flour, but we just need something so that the pizza won't stick to the bottom, but also so that it helps us like move the pizza really quickly off our quote unquote peel and onto the preheated baking sheet. And then we're going to just reshape our pizza ever so slightly, restretch it out just a little bit. So when you're adding like sauce and stuff to your dough, just try and work quickly here. So like don't panic or anything, but if you are too slow, it's gonna be much harder to get the pizza off the peel and into the oven. So we're gonna use just a ball of mozzarella, and I like to tear it up pretty small so that we can get like a really good even amount of cheese throughout the whole thing. So you want to take it off when the cheese is a nice dark deep brown and the crust is like a golden brown as well. And then we like to do a little bit of fresh basil on top. Again, I'm kind of a perfect biter, so I like everything to be like a good bite size. I don't want to like bite into a huge piece of basil and then like have it hang out of your mouth, you know what I mean? Like, yum. So that's like a classic margarita. Look at the crunch. Yes. All right, cool. And now you eat. Really easy. And a little like pizza bianca, if you will, or like a white pizza or a pizza without a sauce. That's just gonna be a little bit of olive oil. Again, more cheese of your choice. We're using mozzarella. We put a bit of dried oregano on top of this as well. And this is gonna go into the oven as is. Yeah, this is like a super easy one. At the end of the cooking process, we actually added some fresh ricotta, which is like a really nice, fresh, cool bite. This is like a great summertime option, I feel like. And then even on top of that, a little bit of fresh pesto that we had. So this is like a really gorgeous, light, fresh pizza. It looks like luxurious, right? There's something about it. It's just very like, I don't know, it's like kid friendly, but it's also like bougie friendly. And then obviously the other fan favorite is a good classic pepperoni. So with that, it's just cheese, sauce, spicy pepperoni. You can grate some fresh parmesan on top at the end of it. None of that weird stuff in the canister. You gotta freshly grate it, it's so much better. Yeah, and the cool thing about pizza is whatever you want. My favorite toppings, seriously, I'm not even kidding, are like bacon and olive. It's like so salty and crunchy. It's so good, I love it. We always say this, I know, but like these are actually the best brownies you're ever going to have. They're gooey, they're chocolatey, they're fudgy. They live up to every expectation you think a brownie should be. We took all the tips and the tricks from the internet, from our old grandma's recipes, from places we'd worked to find the best recipe that we could. Throw out every other recipe that you have for brownies. This is the one you will use going forward for the rest of your life. I'm not trying to like toot our own horn, but like beep beep, you know? All right guys, as always, prep your tin, you know what to do, butter and parchment. So the first cooking job that I ever had was working for a pastry chef, and he made these incredible brownies. And when you start working in kitchens, they always say like write down the recipes because you're gonna forget them later. And of course I did not do that, but there are a few things that I remember from his recipe that I really wanted to incorporate into our brownie recipe. Obviously, good brownies need good chocolate. And the chocolate bar you want to use is dealer's choice. You can go for something really mellow like a milk chocolate bar, or go into something really dark, like an 80% dark chocolate would work really well in here. We're gonna double up on the chocolate, so we're gonna use cocoa powder as well. Because we wanted a really rich, dark flavor and color, we went with the Dutch processed. You can use regular cocoa powder here, but we're always looking for that intense flavor, that intense color. The one on the left used regular cocoa powder. It's kind of drier on top and almost like too dense and fudgy on the bottom. We're adding a little bit of cocoa powder here. We're gonna add even more later. Espresso powder just does a really great job of enhancing any chocolate flavor in a recipe. If you're worried about the caffeine, you can get a decaf powder as well. It's not gonna taste like coffee or espresso, it's really just another flavor enhancer. When we add the hot melted butter to the chocolate, cocoa powder, and espresso powder, it's gonna help melt everything down and dissolve, which is gonna help keep our brownies really fudgy later on. Sugars, we have granulated sugar, and then when deciding between light brown and dark brown, the real difference here is that dark brown has more molasses, ergo more flavor. I don't even know what ergo means. Again, just wanted to knock your socks off with the flavor here, and dark brown was the right one for the job. And we're also gonna add a bit of salt as it brings out the flavor in any baked good. So we're gonna have 6 eggs. Always crack your eggs into a separate bowl in case you get any shell. Best way to remedy that is to use the eggshell. It breaks the surface tension and is the easiest way to get eggshell out of your eggs. You can start by adding 1 egg to the sugar just so you don't make a huge mess. Once you get it going though, you can add the rest of them. No big deal. You don't have to be like super careful like you would for a cake, for instance. So working for that pastry chef, one thing that he did with his brownies was he would beat the living crap out of the eggs and sugar and really, really incorporate tons of air. So much so that it would look like a super thick pancake batter almost. This is what happens when you don't beat the sugar and the eggs. Kind of just falls really flat, right? The great thing about beating the eggs and the sugar is you create like a really solid foundation and you don't have to use a chemical leavener. And then you're gonna pour in that beautiful ganache that we made. Oh my God. Actually, when we were shooting this, there was a crowd of people around us because we couldn't get over how insanely delicious this looked. Oh God, I can't believe we baked these. Honestly, like I could have just eaten the batter myself. I'm really upset that America can't get on the metric system, but like fine. So if we're gonna use cups, always scoop and level to make sure that we had the right amount of flour. If you just take the cup straight into the flour, it's gonna be denser than you need it to be. And you're going to sift the flour and the cocoa powder into the mixture to make sure we have no lumps and just make sure that we're really quickly incorporating it into the rest of the batter. And fold. Because we beat all that air in with the eggs, we don't want to totally deflate that. So just get the dry ingredients incorporated as quickly as you can. Pour the completed batter into your prepped tin. Smooth it out to make sure everything's pretty level. And into the oven it goes. So these are gonna rise quite a bit. After about 20 minutes, we're gonna take them out. This is like my favorite tip of the whole recipe. Take the brownies out and slam them on your kitchen counter. It's gonna crack the top as well as evens out everything and you get a much more like consistent texture. These are the same recipe. The one on the left is not whacked, right whacked. At this point, we're also going to add a bit of sea salt, optional but highly recommended. It adds a little salty bite, sweet and salty, always good. With a lot of baked goods, you'll stick a toothpick in and no batter remains, then you're good. It's kind of not the case with these brownies. You will have a good amount of kind of fudginess that comes out on the toothpick. Trust us, they've been in there for like 45 minutes. They're definitely cooked through. They're just fudgy. When they do cool down, they also will deflate quite a bit. It results in a really even texture all throughout. Again, I can't say fudgy enough. Like, I don't even like fudge, little known thing about me, but these brownies are like insane. I need to cut things nice. They need to be like a good, perfect square. It's so satisfying to see like a perfectly cut batch of brownies, obviously. Oh my gosh. A little tip too is to clean your knife after each cut. So you'll see a little bit of that fudginess comes off. They're fudgy, but they're not dense. And that is it. I mean, look at that texture. Look at it. This is like your go-to brownie batter. It's amazing as is, but you can also mix in anything that you want. More chocolate chunks, potato chips, pretzels. This is like a phenomenal, like standard brownie recipe, but feel free to go crazy and mix in whatever you want. Making brownies from scratch, you know, there's other options out there that are easier, but it's like one of those fundamental baked goods that doesn't take a ton of technique, but they also kind of like go with everything and every event. You know what I mean? Like you have a breakup, brownies. Birthday, brownies. Like, they gotta work for anything. They're just one of those like feel-good, crowd-pleasing desserts that's just like always a win.
Macarons are one of the most popular but also most challenging desserts to get right. We spent many months and made dozens of batches in the pursuit of trying to find a recipe and some foolproof techniques to help you do it right the first time. A perfect macaron should be chewy on the inside and crispy on the outside. It should have those classic feet and a smooth top. First things first, you want to let the egg whites come to room temperature for at least 30 minutes before you get started. Having the egg whites rest is going to result in a much fluffier, airier meringue. So pro tip, a really easy way to separate your whites from your yolks is to actually use your hands. You can alternate between eggshells, but you risk puncturing the egg yolk, you could get some shell in it. It's actually a little more time consuming. If you wash your hands, this is a really easy way to go. Now we can move on to our dry ingredients. So you want your dry ingredients to be really, really fine to ensure that smooth top. This is the time to break out your food processor if you have one. So we're gonna add our dry ingredients to a food processor. We'd recommend pulsing it at least 10 times, but you really can't go too far here. The finer the dry ingredients, the smoother your top is gonna be. Even if you buy extra fine almond flour, it's not gonna be that smooth. You might get a bit of a lumpy surface. If you don't have a food processor, fear not, your macarons can still be delicious, they might just be a little lumpier on top. Another tip to get that really smooth surface is to sift your dry ingredients a few times after you've pulsed it in the food processor. This is just going to ensure a really smooth top so you can get those picture-perfect macarons. Now we're going to move on to our wet ingredients. Start off by beating the egg whites with a pinch of salt. That's just going to help stabilize them. You also want to use the whisk attachment to help beat some extra air into your meringue. So you're going to beat the egg whites just until they get really frothy and are no longer translucent, just like this. That's when you want to start adding the sugar really gradually. If you add too much sugar at once, it's going to deflate all that beautiful air that you just whipped into the meringue. Once all the sugar's added, keep beating until you get stiff peaks. If your peaks are falling over, like this, you still need to keep going. Once they're really stiff like this, you're all set. So if your peaks are stiff enough, you can actually flip a bowl upside down without anything falling out. Once your meringue is good to go, you're going to add the vanilla extract. You don't want to do this too early or you're not going to get those really big, beautiful, stiff peaks. And lastly, we're going to add our food coloring. We'd recommend using a gel food coloring because it gives you a much more vibrant color. Using a liquid food coloring is going to thin your batter out and it's going to fade during baking. It's really subtle, but you can see here how the one with liquid food coloring actually looks more peachy than pink. Now we're ready to combine the wet and dry ingredients. So first, add 1/3 of the dry ingredients to the meringue. Now we're going to macaronage. That's the technique of folding the dry ingredients into the meringue. Traditionally, you gently fold the ingredients together 35 to 40 times, but we found that you actually want to be really aggressive to beat out any remaining air bubbles. That'll help you get a really consistent cookie. So there's not an exact number of times that you need to fold the batter. It's really just something you want to keep an eye on. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the texture should look like wet sand ribbons. Some people describe it as lava, but how many of us have really seen lava? A tried and true test is to do the figure 8 method. One of the biggest mistakes people make is either undermixing or overmixing their batter. Once it's all incorporated, go really slowly and keep practicing that figure 8 until you've got it. That'll really ensure that you don't go too far. Once you can make a figure 8 with the batter without it breaking, you're good to go. Stop here and do not keep mixing. Now that the batter's ready, we're ready to start piping our macarons. Fill a piping bag with the round tip. Put 4 dots of the batter in each corner of your baking sheet. Then place the parchment paper on top. This is going to help secure the parchment paper so it's not going to slide all around as you're piping. A lot of recipes call for silicone mats, but after numerous tests, we found that they can actually make the cookies a little moist. Parchment paper will really dry your macarons out, which is what you want. This was one of my personal biggest revelations during testing. The classic size of a macaron is about 1.5 inches wide. You can buy a template for piping, but you can also just eyeball it like we did. Once the macarons are piped, it's time to drop the tray. Make sure you do not skip this step. Dropping the tray is going to help eliminate any air bubbles. It also is going to ensure that you get a really smooth surface on top. Let the macarons rest at room temperature for 30 minutes to an hour. The macarons are going to get this kind of weird film on top, and you can actually brush your finger back and forth after an hour and see that it's not going to indent. That's a sign that they're ready to go. If you don't do this step, the macarons aren't going to rise properly and you won't get this classic feet. In our case, when we tested it, the feet grew outward instead of upward. Now you want to bake the macarons at 300 degrees for 17 minutes. If you have an oven thermometer, this is a really good time to use it. Make sure your oven's not running too hot or too cold, or the macarons aren't going to come out right. As with all baking, don't open the oven door. If you do, you could deflate the macarons. If your macarons are sticking to the parchment paper after this, it just means they're a little underbaked. You can just pop them back in the oven for a minute or two. When you take the macarons out of the oven, let them cool on the baking sheet for 15 to 30 minutes. When they're done, they should lift right off the parchment just like this. Transfer the macarons to a wire rack to fully dry out and cool before filling. If you don't, all your filling's just gonna melt all over them. So while our macarons dry out, we're gonna work on our filling. We're gonna go with a really classic vanilla buttercream, and we'll talk about ways that you can get a little fancy with your fillings a bit later on. So first, you're gonna cream your room temperature butter. Once it's really beautiful and fluffy, just like this, you're gonna sift your powdered sugar into the bowl. You don't have to sift it, but this will just result in a really smooth, creamy buttercream. Once everything's combined, add the vanilla. Then you can add 1 or 2 tablespoons of heavy cream and mix until it's incorporated. We needed to add a little more cream, and you can just do this a tablespoon at a time until it's the right consistency. Now that the buttercream's done, add it to a piping bag, again fitted with a round tip. Filling the cookies is pretty straightforward. Just pipe a dollop onto the cookie that's a little smaller than the size of the actual cookie. Then press 2 sides together, and you're good. Now, the part that takes the most patience out of this entire process is that we'd actually recommend that you wait at least 24 hours before eating your macarons. This will help them develop the best flavor and texture. You may be tempted to eat one right away, and if you do, we won't tell. But really, it's worth your while to let them rest. Once you feel like you've mastered the basic macaron, feel free to get creative. When you're starting out, the easiest way to customize your macarons is by playing around with food coloring and the flavor of your filling. You could flavor your buttercream, you can make a chocolate ganache, or a lemon curd. The possibilities are truly endless. And those are the basics of how to get started making macarons. They can be pretty intimidating and honestly really easy to mess up if you don't know what you're doing. But if you follow our tried and true tips, you'll be able to master the techniques needed to nail perfect macarons every time. From here, you really just need to try it.
How many did you make?
I think I made probably over 2,000 macarons.
Oh my God.
They take a lot of time, they take patience. If you make a macaron right, you've won life.
Rice is such a staple ingredient, and yet so many people fear it. So many people say, I don't know how to make it gets too sticky, it gets burnt, how do you make the perfect rice? We're here to tell you. There's a few really simple tips and tricks to get that perfect, fluffy, great consistency. The 2 most important things to keep in mind when making rice are timing and ratios. If you cook it too short, it can be hard, and if you cook it for too long, it can just be gummy and mushy. No one wants that. In regards to ratios, if you have too much water, you can just have really wet rice, and if you don't have enough, you can burn your rice. For long grain white rice, you want 1 cup of rice to 2 cups of water. For short grain white rice, you want 1 cup of rice to 1 1/4 cups water. For brown rice, you want 1 cup of rice to 1 3/4 cups water. For whatever type of rice you're making, you're gonna follow a similar process. One tip to help you make the best rice ever is to rinse your rice before cooking it. Rinsing rice helps remove any extra starch. If you're short on time, you can skip this step, but it's a foolproof way to help you get really fluffy, beautiful rice. Some people rinse the rice until the water runs clear. A good method to go by is just rinsing it 3 times. First, I'm going to add the rice and the water and a pinch of salt, totally optional, but it'll give it some extra flavor, and bring it to a boil over high heat. Once the water begins to boil, give it a stir, put the lid on, and turn the heat down to simmer, which is the lowest heat there is. For long grain white rice, you want to cook it for 18 minutes on simmer. For short grain white rice, you want to simmer it for 15 minutes. Brown rice is a bit longer, you want to simmer it for 45 minutes. One really important thing to note is to not remove the lid as you're cooking it. You're steaming the rice and you don't want to let the hot air escape. Just let it be, trust the timing, and it'll come out perfectly. Pro tip, once you remove the pot from the heat, let it steam for an additional 5 to 10 minutes with the lid on, and that's another way to ensure you get really fluffy, beautifully cooked rice. Again, if you're short on time, you can skip this step, but we're trying to get you the best rice possible. It's worth the extra 5 to 10 minutes to get really fluffy rice. Long grain white rice is perhaps the most common rice, at least in America. You can use it for side dishes, pilafs, salads, or just on its own with a protein. Short grain white rice is typically used for sushi, puddings, paella, risotto, and sticky rice. Brown rice is considered to be a healthier option than white rice. It has more fiber, iron, and vitamin B. So white rice is actually brown rice with the bran and germs stripped away, so you're losing some of those nutrients when you're choosing white rice. And while it does take longer to make, it's a bit earthier, nuttier. If you do it correctly, you can actually get a really nice result. Now that you know how to make a really simple pot of rice, we're going to show you how to upgrade it with a few super simple tips and tricks. So first, add olive oil over high heat in the pan. Next up, add shallots, or you can swap this out with any other allium. You could use onions, scallions, garlic, anything that's going to give it a bit of flavor. Cook the shallots for 30 seconds to a minute until it's aromatic and golden brown. Then add the rice, give that a stir to make sure that it's fully coated with the shallots and the olive oil. You only need to do this for about 30 seconds. So right now you're just toasting the rice. That's a really easy way to add some extra nutty flavor. Then add a splash of white wine. This is totally optional. The alcohol burns off and it's just a really nice way, again, to add flavor. You can also swap water for stock, vegetable stock, chicken, beef, whatever you want to use. And again, a pinch of salt will go a long way. So from here, the process is the same. You'll get a really flavorful result without spending too much extra time. The thing is, you can mix and match with what you want to add to upgrade your rice. It's a really easy way to trick your friends into thinking you're extra fancy. It's true, they're gonna love it. If you're someone who makes rice all the time, it might be worth investing in a rice cooker. Rice cookers are super easy to use, they're less fussy, everything's marked out for you in terms of proportions. It's a foolproof way of getting a consistently perfect batch of rice every time. The first steps to becoming a better cook are mastering the basics. Rice is such a staple dish, and if you can master it, it'll just make you a better cook. It really doesn't have to be scary, and it doesn't have to be boring either. If you just pay attention to timing and ratios and add a few flavor boosters, you can have the best rice ever. Tune in next week to Tasty 101. We're making... What are we making?
Mashed potatoes are a must, especially when it comes to the holidays. It's basically the side dish that keeps on giving, am I right? Surprisingly, there are quite a few mistakes when it comes to mastering the art of mashed potatoes. We went through about 20 pounds of potatoes to bring you the ultimate, creamy, super smooth mashed potatoes. They're seriously so good. You're gonna wanna lick the plate. There's two types of potatoes, starchy and waxy. For mashed potatoes, you want a starchy potato. A potato with higher starch and low moisture will yield a fluffier inside. We're using Yukon Gold potatoes. They're actually somewhere in between a starchy and a waxy potato. They're harder to overmash and have a foolproof, creamy texture. We're gonna peel the potatoes before boiling. Some people like to leave the skin on their mashed potatoes, which creates a little bit more texture, but for really creamy, silky smooth mashed potatoes with a uniform texture, it's gonna work a lot better with the skin off. Quick tip. To keep your potatoes from discoloring and oxidizing as they sit out, place them in a bowl of cold water while you work. After you've peeled your potatoes, cut them into 1-inch cubes. This way they're gonna cook more quickly and evenly. Add your potatoes to a pot of cold water and add a very generous pinch of salt. This is gonna help build the layers of flavor as the potatoes cook, which means you'll need less salt down the line. Now we're gonna bring the potatoes to a soft boil over high heat. Once you've reached a soft boil, reduce the heat to low and simmer for about 12 minutes. You'll know your potatoes are ready for mashing when they're fork tender. Go ahead and remove the pot from the heat and drain the potatoes through a colander. At this point, you're actually going to place the potatoes back in the pot over medium-high heat and stir them around for 2 to 3 minutes. That's just going to release any excess moisture. At the end of this, the potatoes should be super dry. When it comes to mashed potatoes, most people use a potato masher or even a fork. Some people use a potato ricer for a more uniform texture, which we're also really big fans of. If you don't have any of those tools and want to get a similar result, you can use a fine mesh sieve. Place the boiled potatoes in the sieve and use a spatula to gently push them down. I'm not gonna lie, this definitely takes more muscle and is more time consuming, but the potatoes are gonna be so silky smooth and beautiful, it's really worth the effort. Whatever you do, do not use a food processor or a hand mixer. This is gonna overwork the potatoes, creating a gummy-like paste. And let's be real, no one wants that. Now, it wouldn't be mashed potatoes without adding some butter. You wanna use unsalted butter because it allows you to control the amount of salt in your mashed potatoes. We made so many variations of mashed potatoes and taste tested all of them. We tried cold butter, milk, melted butter, sour cream, cream cheese, heavy cream. And after all that, we decided to stick with melted butter and heavy cream. While some people do like sour cream and cream cheese, we found that the flavor really stood out and took away from that uniform consistency and texture that we were looking for. Quick tip, you always want to add your butter before adding any cream or milk. This is going to ensure that the texture of the potato remains firm before being softened by all that cream. If you add your butter and your cream all at once, it's going to create this really soupy texture, whereas if you go gradually, it'll be nice and smooth and creamy. So remember how we talked about building flavors? This is another time where you're going to season it with salt. Add your heavy cream to a small saucepan over medium-high heat. This is also the moment when you can enhance the flavor of your mashed potatoes. We're going to add some rosemary sprigs and garlic, but you can get creative with other herbs and ingredients as well. Bring the heavy cream mixture to a simmer. Once it's simmering for a few minutes and that cream is getting really infused with flavor, you're gonna strain out the garlic and the rosemary through a sieve, and then add just the cream to the potatoes little by little until they're fully incorporated. Remember, if you add all the heavy cream at once, it's just gonna become a soupy mess. As you fold the heavy cream into the mashed potatoes, you're gonna see this really smooth texture start to come together. I mean, it's so beautiful. It's that easy. Your potatoes are finally ready to serve. So, because it's tasty, we're gonna top it with more butter. We're also gonna add some freshly ground black pepper, some chives. You can really experiment with your toppings, but this is a pretty classic preparation. Or if it's that special time of year, pass the gravy, baby. I mean, come on, what's not to love? And there you have it, the creamiest mashed potatoes you've ever laid eyes on. Or in our case, our taste buds.